Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, president of the London Lyceum and host of Kiffin's Keep. And as always, I'm excited to be here with you all today. In today's episode, I'm going to be covering a listener question about 1 Timothy 2:12. So we're going to be covering topics like gender, society, ecclesiastical leadership, and more. As always, don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. Do subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, and then drop a comment on what you think. I imagine with a topic like this, you're going to have comments. So comment away, but please be nice as much as possible. I may be a little bit fragile. Who knows? I guess we'll find out depending on how many people comment and what you comment. So I received a message, which, by the way, if you're a regular viewer or listener, you can drop me a message at thelondonlyceum.com/kiffinskeep. This is where this individual sent me a message. That way, if you have a public YouTube page or whatever with your actual name, if you want to ask something, you don't have to ask it there. But you can ask it there if you want to. That's cool. So in this message I received, it says this, quote, I wrote a paper on 1 Timothy 2:12, and I found that there was very little written about the extent of its implications in society. I find it very hard to understand where to draw the line, end quote. He has other questions, such as, do we draw the line for women teaching and exercising authority at the church, or does it extend outwards? What are the limits of teaching and authority outside the church? So great questions. A couple of thoughts on this. We'll see how long this goes. Number one, I haven't thought or talked about this or read about this in a year or two, so I'm a little bit rusty. So be kind to me for what I'm about to say. I used to think about it a lot. I used to read about it a lot. I've written about it, so I feel confident in giving some sort of answers, but they may not be the coolest and the best or most sophisticated answers anymore. Number two, a lot of people don't like 1 Timothy 2:12. It's be Thomas Jefferson text. Let's cut it out, remove it, just like the 1 Corinthians passage 14:33 or whatever it is. Let's get rid of them. I don't think you can get rid of them. I think they're scripture, and you have to deal with them. Third, those who want to relativize it or read it in non-traditional ways, which I think a traditional reading would be at least 1 Timothy 2:12 says that at least at the minimum, elders or bishops or overseers, whatever you want to call them, are limited to men, and there cannot be women there. I think that's a traditional reading. I take that as the baseline for that text. Those who want to read that differently, read it. There's different reading strategies for how to overcome that. Some are very unpersuasive. Some are you can see how they're reading the text. I want to be careful on that because I think there are some well-meaning and biblically rock solid, biblically committed egalitarians who read the text differently than me, and I want to respect that. There are some egalitarians and others who read that text and they really just want to cut it out of the Bible, and I don't respect that, and I think that's ridiculous. So I don't think there's necessarily a slippery slope to read this text differently than to read it in the traditional way of elders and overseers or whoever else are limited to men. I think there are legitimate ways that people could read that differently and still be seeking to honor Scripture and to honor God in understanding His Word. So with that out of the way, I will go ahead and start with the text. So 1 Timothy 2:12, as a reminder, just the simple, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Very clear, very blunt, very specific. So this is the Apostle Paul, and just because he says, I do not permit, does not mean that it's just localized to him and it's a very specific context. At least I don't think that. I think that's fairly obvious because I don't think you want to relativize away the other I statements from the Apostle Paul. So what do we do with this text? Number one, I think it's very clearly at least about elders, because you get that text in 1 Timothy 3, right after this, talking about elders and the qualifications for elders and the local church. So I do think this text is definitely specifically focused on God's church and not focused necessarily on the society at large. So we can't necessarily draw implications right away for how do we think about men and women in society at large based on 1 Timothy 2:12. This is specifically speaking to the redemptive gathering, the spiritual kingdom, how the church functions, and not necessarily the society as a whole, culture as a whole, the nations and states and communities. It's speaking specifically of the church. Now, I do think you have other texts that are very clear about the nature of the family as well. First Timothy 3, First Peter 3, where and other texts where wives submit to their own husbands, and not to any husband, to their own husband. That familial order is, I think, rather obvious throughout all of Scripture. And then you have this sort of like this church order that I think you get in First Timothy 2:12. How does Paul ground this? So depending on how you read this text, you might take this to mean more broader implications versus more limited implications. So a lot of people will read this First Timothy 2:12 and then read the following verses, where why does Paul not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority? Well, because Adam was formed first, and so then they're going to take that and say, well, that's a creational grounding. But I think we need to be careful with how we ground these things, because Adam being formed first is not necessarily like a true creational ontological difference there. That to me is that's the difference in order and in timing, and there's a specific purpose for that. So it's not irrelevant, but it's not in the same sense of like you are created with certain capacities. This is talking about the sort of arc of the story of how God created the world and how he sort of intrinsically ordered things to tell a particular story. I think you get this in Ephesians 5, where how Christ and the church are supposed to be, or I guess marriage is supposed to be a picture of Christ and the church. God has designed by his creational ordering that certain things will mirror other things and will be a picture to something else. And so I think this Paul is recalling sort of a redemptive historical approach to thinking about why women are not allowed to exercise authority or to teach over man. And so I think it's supposed to be sort of this redemptive historical story piece here. So that's not like to say that a woman can't have the skills or the qualities or like the ability to do these things necessarily. There's plenty of really skilled women, really gifted women. But if you place certain people, certain actors in the wrong role that was not designed for them in the story, then even if they have the skills to do it, it's going to tell a different story. And so I think that's fundamentally what's going on there in that text. So I don't think we can necessarily immediately draw large scale scoped answers from First Timothy 2:12 anyway. But that doesn't mean that biology doesn't matter. So biology very much matters. You get that. First Peter 3, I think, is the one that also talks about women as the weaker vessels. That's, I think, a very clear biological reality. Men are biologically constituted with the potential to become fathers and husbands, and women are given the biological potential to become wives and mothers. And those roles require different qualities, different levels of qualities, and we're biologically hardwired with the capabilities to do these different things in different ways. I, as a man, do not have the biological capacity to feed another human, my child, from my body. That is impossible given my biological nature. And because of that, my ability to nurture my son, or if I had a daughter, my daughter, would be significantly different than the way that my wife would be able to. And that's just a given based on biology. And so I do think biology matters for men and women's roles in society at large, even if there's not prescriptive, clear, explicit data of here's how you're supposed to function in society as a man or a woman. There is clear biological determination to do certain things, to be better at certain things than others. And that's not bad. That's just saying we should recognize biological reality, that we're biologically all the way down have particular propensities and skills that are just naturally occurring based upon whether we're a man or a female, which chromosome we have. And so I think biology should call us to exercise a level of wisdom and prudence depending on the scenario. So you could take various examples of should women lead a marketing company? And you could say, well, I think that seems to be okay. There's nothing intrinsically wrong about that. A woman could lead a marketing company. She could be president of a company, even if there are men underneath her in the hierarchy of leadership. That's okay. What about a Major League Baseball team or a National Football League team? Well, you would think that theoretically she could fulfill all the obligations of whatever this role is. However, there seems to be a lack of prudence in some of these things, just given who she would be having authority over. Grown men who are participating in a violent sport. And there seems to be something that's missing from the conversation there, that you would have to say, well, I think that this is not a wise role for a woman to fulfill for these different reasons. You have to exercise prudence to look at the context, look at the scenario, look at the time, look at the space, look at all these different things and say, okay, what's appropriate for this? What's most wise for this? And I think you get hints at different things from the biblical text. Titus 2:5 tells us that older women should teach younger women to work at home. But you have Proverbs 31 telling how women, this virtuous woman who's working with willing hands and dressing with strength and all these different things. And I think what that's fundamentally just telling us is that you must exercise wisdom and prudence in the world. The Bible doesn't give us a rule for every little scenario. What do we do? Let me turn to the manual and let me understand what I do in in section A, lowercase b, after that, number 9765 scenario. It doesn't give us all those things. It gives us generally held principles and understanding of how the world is structured, how creation is structured, and then you are supposed to go exercise wisdom and prudence depending on where you're at. And I think this cuts both ways. Both men and women. Should a man lead a daycare? Theoretically, a man has all the capabilities necessary to lead a daycare, but it's probably unwise. It's probably not prudent for a man to lead a daycare for various reasons, and that shouldn't be, I think, very, I don't know, controversial. Maybe it is. It shouldn't be. I don't think. Men can theoretically do that, but there's nothing. There's something that's just intrinsically probably not a wise decision. So then the question, I think the real interesting question would be things like, can women teach or exercise spiritual authority, particularly over a man outside the confines of a local church? Can they just do anything a non-ordained man can do? Well, I think there's a couple of things. You can't fundamentally exercise spiritual authority outside the confines of a local church where there's officers like elders and deacons, and there's gathered authority structure in the church. So if you're doing something outside the church, you're not really exercising authority. But can you teach? I mean, I think women can teach outside the confines of gathered local church authority over men. We have numerous examples of this. We see Priscilla and Mary and others who are teaching men, but it's just not in this sort of authority laden role in authority, and then in the gathered worship context. And so I think if you look at the biblical text, you're never going to find those sorts of examples of women performing those actions, plus 1 Timothy 2. So I think there is freedom to say, you're very gifted, go ahead and teach men. That's fine. You can learn in a classroom context, and it's outside the confines of the gathered worship of the local church, and you're not holding an office, and you're not exercising authority over people. To me, I think that's totally fine. I've talked about that here, I think, in an episode before where I talked about John Piper's view on women, where I think, different people have cashed these things out different ways. And you have some, like I think Kevin DeYoung, were very separate. Men and women are literally created in different realms, which to me is just kind of, I guess it makes a little bit of sense, but it's also a little bit weird. But then you have John Piper, who's really weird, though I respect him, and I respect, to me, it's the cleanest answer probably, because it takes out the sort of like the having to exercise a lot of prudence in all these different scenarios where you don't really know what to do, because he's going to say even a woman giving directions to the nearest gas station to a man is problematic, and it's going to cut against the very order of creation. And I think that's just crazy. That's the best I can say it. I think that's crazy. I understand the rationale, the impulse to want to say that, but I think it's problematic. I think it's over determining the text, where I think the text is a little bit more open-ended, and giving us the call to say, exercise wisdom. Here are some generally principles. Here's some clear commands. Now you have to figure out how to live in the world and to do the best given your situation and your context. So would I have specific advice for every scenario? I can't really give universal advice in a format like this. You'd have to give like the particular scenario, and then you give particular advice into that particular scenario, given all the different contextual factors. And that's going to determine whether it's a wise thing, or it's a good thing, or it's a right thing, or if it's useful and beneficial for all involved or not. You have to consider all the factors. There are some clear cut and dried things like wives and husbands and elders in a local church and teaching on the authoritative role on a gathered Sunday. Those things to me are very clear and cut and dried. Other stuff, not so much. I don't think it's bad to say that, and I don't think that's woke or liberal to say that. And if anybody thinks it's woke or liberal, then they haven't done much work to think about these topics, at least in my opinion. So the more stronger patriarchal vision of where men are in authority in every universally in a universal scope, I think is problematic for a number of reasons, and is just faulty on biblical grounds, theological grounds, philosophical grounds, all biological grounds, scientific grounds, all those things. I think it falters in significant ways. So maybe I do hope in some future time when I have more time, I'd love to devote more research to these sorts of things again, particularly some of the philosophical conundrums and theological challenges, and to construct a more robust vision of these sorts of things, because I think biology is good, and we should have a better sense of understanding that as Christians, how that works out in our lives and our communities and beyond. So anyway, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Do you think I'm crazy off base? Do you think I'm right on? Drop me a comment, whatever you think, in the comments below. And if you want me to answer your question, you can go like this fellow. Go to the londonlyceum.com/kiffins-keep, and you can drop me a message there, and I'll talk about your question. I will answer it as best I can, and hopefully not make everybody mad, but maybe I'll make some people mad. Maybe I'll make the right people mad. I don't know. Anyway, I appreciate you all for tuning in to Kiffin's Keep. And as always, I look forward to thinking with you all soon.